Welcome back to BrainWise, Our Lives Decoded. I'm your host, Cole Bastian, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Dixon. And today we've got a ton of great information on another of the 5 dynamics of the non-conscious part of the brain. And we've got a jam-packed episode full of great BrainWise tips and all kinds of things to help you decode your life as we continue on this journey of understanding our brains even more. But before we dive in, Phil, catch us up on your week, what you've been up to. You talked to us a little bit about your kitchen remodel. How is that going? And what else has been going on in your life and your spouse's life over the past week?
The kitchen remodel moves ahead. It's not obvious it's moving ahead because this week they've been putting electric in, and most of it happens either under the house, in the attic, or in the walls. So not obvious that it's moving forward, but they're saying they'll have that done today, which is great. So my wife, Kathy, has been working too hard, as she always does, but there's no changing that. And I think I may have mentioned that I'm in the process of writing a fiction book. And so that's progressed this week. And one of the things I read was a book by Stephen King on how to write. And one of the things he recommends is find a great space that you really enjoy. And I realized that I was actually not at a comfortable desk. I wasn't enjoying the space. It was too much of a jumble. There was no organization. And so I spent a day and a half organizing where I want to write. And it feels 100 times better.
I love it. And is that your BrainWise moment or tip for the week that you wanted to share with our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. You're finding the space around me. It's a little bit like if you're driving along the road and your tire's going flat. The best thing to do is pull over, change the tire, and then you can drive. It takes a little bit of time, and that's what it took. It took a day and a half of my life to reorganize the workspace I had. But now I feel like I can drive at 100 miles an hour.
Don't try that at home, listeners.
On the German Autobahn, I could.
Yeah, or maybe if you're playing a video game or something, perhaps. But
there we go.
Goodness, that's really productive. You won?
I said, what was your BrainWise moment this week?
Yeah, we had quite a busy week. Joey and I have been doing a little bit of travel. As you can see, we're coming from a little bit of a different perspective, but visiting some family, specifically my mom for her birthday, which will be super exciting. But my BrainWise moment for the week is right now, I personally, really from a professional perspective, am going through a lot of transition that is to some degree bittersweet in some senses. I think it's probably closing some chapters as well as opening new ones and looking at what is the future. And for those of us that create a sense of identity to some degree in the work that we do and the profession that we're in, the transition can certainly, especially being in the middle of it, can cause a lot of different emotions to come up. And so one of the things, and it's interesting because oftentimes I'm coaching others, Phil, that are going through something, and then I end up hearing things that I say to them that I probably should have been doing myself along the journey. And so I was actually having a conversation with someone, and I said, one of the things I would recommend you do is a worksheet that on one side of the paper, you write all the things that you can control. And then on the other side of the paper, write all of the things that you cannot control. Because when you are going through transition or you're in an experience, there are so many things that you can control. And then there are a ton of other things that you are just not in your sphere of control or your sphere of influence. It's probably fairly anecdotal to say, okay, relinquish the things that you can't control, whatever it is. It's great to have that mindset, but then what do you really do with it? And so one of the things that I suggested, and I actually ended up doing all of this myself, was so when I experience those things that I cannot control any longer, or I'm not able to influence, what's my recovery process or my action plan going to be when I experience those things? Am I going to call someone? Is that step 2? Is that step 1? Is my first step to take some really deep breaths, depending on the emotional response that I'm having to that particular item? So what are the things that I'm going to do? And coming up with that in a really calm and collected state, so that way the plan can be well thought out. And then when it does actually happen, that there's something that comes up that I can't control, I know, okay, due to the severity of this particular item, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to let that take some deep breaths, let it go. Or maybe I do need to call someone to talk this one out because it is a bit more gut wrenching, or it's causing a bit more things to come up in my emotions. So that was my BrainWise moment this week, was one, listen to the feedback that I'm giving to others. And then two, go a little bit beyond just the anecdotal, don't worry about the things you can't control any longer, and instead take some action to write out what are your next steps in the action plan that you might use when those things come up.
Yeah. So you've triggered off a number of thoughts for me.
Yeah.
And there are a number of, we'll call them a BrainWise models that we can actually pull and bring to bear on those very situations. Is that something we should explore right now?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's share one of them with our listeners.
One of them, the first one is the words that we use. When it's an important one, for the words that we say to ourselves or other people, when we say, don't worry, what word do you think the brain hears?
Don't.
It actually hears worry. But we actually have an inverse effect to what we're doing. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but instead of saying to somebody, don't worry, it's look on the bright side. I'm a Monty Python fan. That comes to, but seriously, if you look at what the brain is recording and remembering,
Right.
if you can make that into a positive side rather than a negative. So that's the first tip that you can do immediately, especially when you're giving somebody else advice. The second one is somebody gave me a taxonomy, which is a fancy word for a structure. And this lady said, divide life into 3. Those things you can change, those things you can influence, and everything else is a law of physics. You're not going to have any influence on it whatsoever. And that, for me, it was a very trivial but important lifestyle moment when I can divide life. The third model is more of a analytical model. It doesn't work for everybody. But if something's happening around you and you want to turn around and say, let me think this through, what I recommend is get a huge sheet of paper. This is not a huge sheet of paper, but get a large sheet of paper, the biggest you can. And on the left-hand side, put a positive, and then down the bottom, negative, plus, minus. And next to the plus, whatever's going to happen, right, what's the best that can happen out of this scenario? And write your list of the possible best, because in most changes, there's a mixture of downside and upside. So we've got 5 times as many circuits in the brain to address the negative. Let's actually explicitly address the positive. So that's the first step. The second part of that is, if all those things happen, what would you do next? That puts the brain into a future thinking state and can sometimes even make you a little breakthrough that says, oh, that's a possibility. Now let's go into what the brain's really good at, and that's analyzing the negative. And then write down as many negatives as you can possibly think about. Okay, so I'm in a career change. What's the worst that can happen? I might not be good at what I'm moving into. I might regret. And whatever they are, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, doesn't matter. Then for each of those things that you write down, ask 3 questions. The first one is, what could I possibly do to prevent that from happening? And you answer all those questions. The second thing is, what will I do if I experience it happening? And then the third, and you mentioned this, is, what would I do to recover? All right. So now you've got all these negatives on the left. You've got those 3 questions. So you've got a grid of things that you can do. Fill out that grid. It might take you an hour, it might take you an hour and a half. But it does a couple of things. Number one, it gives the brain the satisfaction that you've explored all the possibilities, both the positives and the negatives. And the brain loves to go, oh, okay, we're right. If there isn't anything in there that you can't live with, there's your focus, right? Because that's going to mean, hey, I just can't live with that. I've got to attend to that. The third thing to do is to look at and go, are there any patterns that I'm seeing that come up again and again? And I've done this several hundred times with several hundred people. There's always some patterns that come out of it. And that's a question you go, in that case, that's probably important. I need to address it. And if I address it now, would it impact whether it's a negative outcome or a positive outcome? So just doing that, it also, the final thing is once you've got that list of positive things and a list of negative things, you can actually turn around and say, I've just created a goal statement for this particular aspect of my life. Because the goal is how to make those positive things happen and avoid the negative things. So it's a useful instrument. It takes a while to do it, but it's very satisfactory for the brain. So I've seen it applied from everything from strategic planning in a large organization to one lady I was working with probably 20 years ago who decided to use that technique to decide whether she wanted to get married or not.
Interesting.
Very easy to do, a little time consuming. If you can do it with somebody who you trust, a significant other, a spouse or whatever, that's even easier because very often they will see the positive side of things when you don't. Also,
Yeah.
they might see the negative side if you're looking at things too rosily. Okay, that's it.
No, well, and Phil, it's interesting as you were describing it. One, I think it's great because it gives people actionable, and even myself, as I was reflecting on everything that's going on in my life professionally right now, it gives actionable steps. Because a lot of times when you're in the midst of turmoil, you're just swirling. And what do you do with all of that? What are the next steps? How do you manage that successfully? And so you can take that energy and put it into something that then gives you an actionable next step on how you can begin to move forward and use that energy for something positive. And the other thing that kind of came to mind as you were describing it is, or two things really, is remember to, as you're doing that exercise, I can imagine that there's probably some emotions that are going to come up. There's probably some frustration or just different things. And so extending yourself grace as you go through that process, especially if it's something related to a personal transition that you're going through or a career transition. And then also the ability, and I would imagine it probably happens somewhat naturally in that process, but then it's probably going to have to be somewhat intentional also, where you extend yourself or you demonstrate self-empathy, and that it's okay that you're experiencing the emotions that you're experiencing, and the process that you're going through is helping you to define what you're going to be able to do with some of those things as you move forward. So those were the two things that came to mind as you were describing it, because I can imagine, at least for myself, some of the emotions that would be coming out as I'm thinking through the current transition that I'm going through, knowing how much it means to me and just what the next phase of this is going to look like.
Yep. And if anybody wants, they can get a hold of us, obviously. And I do have templates that I can actually, basically Word documents, that if somebody wants a copy of them, happy to send it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will share the email address at the end of the episode for folks that you can reach out, and we'd be happy to share that with you. All right, Phil, are you ready to dive into the second dynamic of 5 of the non-conscious part of our brain, which is irrationality?
I'm ready.
Let's go ahead and give it a whirl and see what information we can share with the listeners today. So, Phil, let's start off with just a question to get us starting into the moment. How do we reconcile the fact that we are wired for such powerful thinking and yet often act so irrationally?
Well, it all comes back to the non-conscious brain. We don't have total control of everything we do. It's the non-conscious brain that actually drives us towards irrational behavior. We don't always act in our own best interest. In fact, some cases we self-sabotage. But that's big statements, and I think it's time to pull that apart and see what's going under the hood.
Yeah, let's do that. Help us understand when we say the second dynamic of the non-conscious brain is irrationality, what does that actually mean?
I'm going to jump in straight to a discussion about fairness. I don't
Mhm.
think we've had that discussion before. So, in the brain, unfairness triggers us. If we see something that's unfair, I think we mentioned some of this in our first session. And if something's
Briefly.
unfair to either me or to someone that's important to me, or even somebody that's an acquaintance of mine, a group of people, nations, whatever it might be, we get triggered by things that are unfairness. Not everyone gets triggered the same way, but those people that are oriented towards fairness get triggered. Okay,
Mhm.
we've covered that before. Let's look at what's going on inside the brain. When something unfair happens, it triggers off the same circuitry in the brain as if you weren't disgusted by eating rotten meat or sour milk, or I won't go into any of the more graphic details, then you probably died and your genes aren't in the gene pool. So those are people that survived were disgusted. And it's one of the most important survival mechanisms in our brain. In fact, I think it was the movie Inside Out actually identified 5 emotions, and one of them was because it's one of the most important survival mechanisms. And so that's why when we get triggered, it's not just a, oh, yeah, it's happening. The brain perceives it as a threat to the survival. So
Mhm.
that's the unfairness part and the fairness part. To look at a practical application.
Yeah.
Are you willing to play a game with me again?
Always.
All right. So the game, and this was developed by a wonderful guy, Daniel Kahneman, and his partner Tversky. And just as an aside, we can edit this out if it's not important, but Daniel Kahneman was an Israeli psychologist. And he was the one that actually, with this piece of research we're going to talk about, he developed the concept that we are not a rational thinking individual.
Hmm.
To that point in time, all the economists had talked and based their theories on the rational person. Along comes Kahneman and says, that's actually wrong. We're not rational. And he won a Nobel Prize for that piece of work for economics. But he was a psychologist. It really pissed off the economists that he got the prize.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Yeah.
So, anyway, and the piece of work he did was the following, and he's done lots of them, and we'll talk a lot about his work. So, let's say it's you and Joey, right? And I'm going to give you $100,
Oh.
right? And you've got to
Mhm.
share it with Joey.
Okay.
And you can share it any way you want,
Oh, perfect.
right? But you can't talk to Joey about it.
So I just have to give it to him,
You
whatever I'm
just,
going to give.
whatever you're going to offer him,
Hmm.
what would you offer him?
I'm being playful. There was one part of my brain that was being playful, and then on the other part of my brain, I probably would split it 50-50. If I was being playful, I'd probably offer $1.
There we
Um,
go.
yeah.
All right.
But that's the playful side of me, teasing, getting things going, but really I would have probably done 50-50 because that's really who
50-50, and there's the large possibility that Joey's going to accept that. He knows the conditions of the game. So what if you offered him 40 and you kept 60? What do you think he'd do?
because I can't talk to him about it, I think he'd still keep it, right?
Okay. What about if you offered him 30?
I would assume in similar context he would still keep it.
What about if you offer him 1?
I think he still would because for everyone to know, my husband, he definitely likes to, when he sees a quarter on the ground or a dime, he is one that will pick it up, which I certainly appreciate because we don't want to have all that on the ground, but he definitely will do that. Whereas I might actually look at it and just walk away. So I think he would accept it.
Okay. And that proves that Joey is a very rational individual and a
Hmm.
very rare individual.
I'd probably look at it and go, oh, $1, I'm good. I'd probably give it to someone that I would think is more in need. Not that it's not $1, but someone who might need it more than me.
The rational person says, it was $1 I didn't have. The irrational person says, no, that's not fair.
Yeah.
And it turns out that there's a cliff which occurs at about 20% of the original ante. So
Hmm.
there's a cliff for many people that basically turn around and says, if it's less than 20% of the original, it's unfair to me. And therefore I'm not going to.
Mm.
Whereas in actual fact, as you described about Joey, he would accept anything because it's a money he didn't have before.
Right.
The
Now,
irrational.
if he went into the game knowing the amount of money that I had received, he would probably still accept the dollar, Phil, but there would be some tense emotions as to why am I only giving him $1 and not 50%.
That's exactly right. And those emotions are driven by
Right.
the unfairness. What about if you said, okay, Joey, I'm going to give you 60,
Oh, he'd be thrilled.
70,
Oh, yeah, he'd be over the moon.
80?
He'd be at Macy's right now.
He's a very rational guy because
Mm-hmm.
that cliff I was talking about occurs at the other end as well.
Hmm.
Because for many people, they would go, no, that's not fair to you. And they wouldn't accept it because it's not fair to you. Fairness
Hmm.
drives those two cliffs.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
I can see
fascinating.
that definitely in myself, Phil, for sure. And I think Joey might be at Macy's with the 80, but then he would probably come back with something for himself and something for me, in all
Absolutely.
fairness. So,
Now, what's fascinating about this is, first of all, you can, if you want to go on Google or Google Scholar. By the way, have we talked to anybody about Google Scholar?
we have not, but we can certainly share with everyone what it is.
Oh, if you're listening to this, and of course, that's a stupid statement to hear it, you are listening to it. But there is an element in Google called Google Scholar, which does a search for you in exactly the same way as Google does, but it focuses on peer reviewed articles. And so you don't get all the commercial crap that comes through as well. So anyway, Google Scholar. If you so you can do Kahneman research on fairness on Google Scholar. That research and that experiment has been repeated many times. I was presenting at a conference in Prague in the Czech Republic about 6, 7 years ago, and I decided to run an experiment. I was going to be doing the same session on 3 separate occasions, one each day. And so I did the session. I pulled the 2 volunteers out of the audience like I normally do. I had the $100 and I gave them, and the whole experiment failed.
Mm.
The person took $1.
Wow.
And I went, oh, okay, I must have set it up wrong. So the next day, I did the same thing. I'm a slow learner. It failed. The third day, I stopped and I said, what's going on? And an older gentleman in the audience said, don't forget, we used to be driven by communism.
Wow.
So it is, and the research mostly was done in Western organizations, Western countries, where if you go
Mm.
outside of that environment, the definition of fairness tends to be, should we say, flexible.
Wow. Very interesting.
Yeah,
That's really fascinating.
fascinating stuff.
So it is really interesting, especially because I guess that fairness is so connected to rational or irrational behavior in this case. And it leads me to another question that I had for you, Phil, that I think will be interesting for our listeners to hear and understand is, can you unpack the ultimatum game for us and what it reveals about our tendency to value fairness over logic?
Help me understand, remind me, my brain's gone fuzzy.
Yes, let me. So this came from obviously my good friend Chad. So let me go and ask him really quick. Give me two
Because
seconds.
I've got a feeling some people call that the ultimatum game.
That you were just describing.
Yeah, that's okay.
That is the same thing. Oh, very good. So you actually went right into it. We just didn't. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to, instead of saying it that way, I'm just going to actually summarize it by calling it that so that people know
Got
that's
it.
what it's called.
That's great.
Very interesting, Phil. So, for our listeners, you may hear that described as the ultimatum game, and in some contexts, and really describes our tendency to value fairness over logic. And what's interesting, this can sometimes show up in salary negotiations, feedback conversation, and even family dynamics. We'd rather walk away with nothing than accept something that feels unfair. And to some degree, Phil, it's proof that logic takes a back seat to perceived justice, especially when trust is on the line. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And in fact, I worked for Apple for a long while, and one of my colleagues there was asked to do a negotiation seminar. And the first part in the morning was she was negotiating on behalf of Apple. And she actually did better negotiation. She scored higher than anyone had ever done in that particular session. In the afternoon, it was negotiating for her salary. She did worse than anybody else had ever done because she was willing to walk away with nothing and not stand up for herself in that negotiation. So these dynamics all play out, and sometimes they have severe consequences.
Yeah, for sure. Phil, help us understand, how does the language we use, like framing or metaphor, actually shape the decisions that people make?
Oh, lots of ways. So I'm going to take framing to start with, and then we'll use metaphor. And probably the best framing example I know is the one about, again, group of, these were MDs, they were doctors, these are learned professional medical people. They were taken into a group and they were given a fictitious case. And the case was an isolated village. And the isolated village somehow was going to be threatened with a virus of some sort. And it was fatal. And each of the doctors could do something about it. They were split into two groups. One group was told, if you inject the antivirus into these people, you will kill 20% of them. The other group was told, if you inject this antivirus, you will save 80%.
Wow.
The first group elected not to inject, and the second group elected to inject. But it is the same data with different outcomes, with the word kill the people versus save the people. How you frame it up impacted the outcome. Now, that's a sort of fairly serious event that way, but the way we use words can, in fact, significantly impact the outcome.
Wow. And how does that connect to irrationality?
Because we don't know it's going on. We're not aware. Either as the deliverer of the word, we are clumsy often with delivering the words and we're not thinking them through ahead of time. But also as the recipient, we're not unpacking it and go, wait a minute, what does that actually mean? Just take it for what it said.
Interesting.
Again, what we're trying to do here is give people mental models about how to decode what's going on in their life and not just be driven by this 99% non-conscious brain of ours.
Yeah, go ahead.
Another piece of research was being done particularly on metaphors, and that is they were talking about coming up with an idea and presenting it to a group. And the metaphor you use can often be a significant change in how the group perceives it. And the experiment that was done on this occasion was the metaphor of a seed versus a light bulb. And let me explain. And that is when this, on half the stuff that was put across, the metaphor was used as an idea and a light bulb, a creativity, and something that happened instantaneously. You flick the light bulb. The other one was a metaphor of a seed, of planting something in the ground, and it slowly grew. In the first one, there was to a group of venture capitalists. They would all invest in the light bulb, but they didn't invest in the seed. All the other data was the same, just the change of metaphor.
Interesting.
And again, this is all going on. The people that afterwards were interviewed and said, okay, so what was actually happening in there? And they weren't pulling apart.
Of course we do.
I don't think we've covered this one before for the listeners, but if we have, we can edit it out. And that is, do you and Joey eat out?
We do.
Yeah. At a nice restaurant?
Yeah, occasionally we'll do a mixture of nice restaurants and then maybe middle of the road.
And when you leave, do you give a tip?
Yes.
And what do you base the tip on?
Based on service.
Service. Mm-hmm. And typically, for many people, it's service, it's ambiance, and the quality of the food. Right? So that's typical.
Right.
A guy called Cialdini did some work on this, and some of his students and followers. And what they did is, does anything else make a difference? And so what they found was that if they gave, in this case, it was a little, you ever seen those red and white mints that people put on the plate that they bring you the invoice with? Yeah.
I could see it where it's a little extra added bonus. So probably not consciously I'm sitting there thinking, oh, I'm going to give them an extra $1 or $2 because the mint's there. But I can imagine in the non-conscious part of my mind, I might be thinking that I need to give them a little more.
That's exactly right. And in fact, what happened was that people that received that one mint, on average, gave a 3% increase in tip.
Wow.
And yet when they were interviewed outside the restaurant, they went, no, it had no difference whatsoever. But over averages, 3% increase in tip. What about 2 mints? Turns out that 2 mints, on average, 13% increase in tip.
Really? Wow.
Now, if you're a server and you know by putting 2 mints onto the plate, you can significantly have an impact on your take-home earnings for the night, guess what you're going to do?
You're going to put 2 mints on the plate.
What about putting a mint on the plate, walking away, coming back with another mint and saying, here, forgot this? 23% increase average tip.
Wow.
And yet all of the people who are doing the tipping are not, that's all going on at a non-conscious level. Hey, wow. And what goes on at that is that, oh, he or she, the server, thinks I'm special. That's the level at which we can get influenced by these things. I think you may have a couple more questions.
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting because one of the things that I was thinking about is, as we're thinking, I'm sure there's more examples, and we're going to talk a little bit about anchoring here in a moment. I think will be interesting, is a good transition for us. One of the things that I wanted to just share from an organizational perspective, or even from a relational perspective, when we talk about framing and metaphors specifically, as you were describing that, what came to my mind is that words don't just communicate. It's really constructing our reality. And I think we've begun to understand that, Phil, as we've gone along this podcast journey. But a couple of examples, I think that for me that I was pulling out as I was listening to you from an organizational perspective that do make a fairly significant difference that we do use organizationally is we say nurturing talent lands very different than building performance. And in relationships, he snapped versus he cracked under pressure paints two very different pictures and certainly could influence how we react in that particular situation. And so I just think as you were going through that, those were two things that kind of popped into my mind to provide as additional context for folks as they're listening. How would you apply that within your professional and then your personal life? If you think about even from the way that we are describing things, how is it ultimately going to get the response from someone? It may not be that they're consciously thinking of how they're going to respond that way, but based off what you're describing, it sounds like it's coming from that non-conscious dynamic of their brain because of how we irrationally are responding to what the framing of words are being used and how they're being described to us.
Yeah, those are two great examples. They are directly applicable in both the social environment and the work environment. And really what we're saying is take care. Use the word that's most appropriate and is likely to get you the result you want, as opposed to being, I said earlier on, clumsy with our use of words. That we do tend to be clumsy.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll probably talk about this as we go along and we share more on how people can actually apply this. It takes some intentional effort, especially when you get into the heat of a moment, specifically from a relational perspective. How do you not say the thing that first comes to your mind? It takes a lot of emotional intelligence, some emotional resilience to be able to hold back and rethink what is it you might say versus the first thing that pops into your mind. We'll certainly share some of those things as we go along. But I think, Phil, as we look at transitioning, the anchoring effect seems to be everywhere. Phil, the anchoring effect seems to be pretty much everywhere. What makes the brain so susceptible to the first piece of information that it sees or that we see?
That's a great question. Probably it is because it's the first. So if you, for example, a lot of the testing has been done on what do people remember? And if I give you a list and you probably will remember the first thing on that list, and then probably, secondly, the last thing on the list, the ones in the middle. The first thing is an important thing, the first thing out of someone's mouth, the first thing that you see, the first number, all those things tend to anchor. It's also things that are extreme will be an anchor as well. So I think we talked about the high priced bottle of wine in a restaurant. That will anchor. Can I give you a little anecdote?
No, please.
I was in a restaurant in Las Vegas many years ago, and on the menu, on the wine menu, there was a bottle of Rothschild. I think it was 1906 or something like that, and it was $20,000. Now, personally speaking, I can't imagine a life where I'd spend $20,000 on a bottle of wine. But
Lord.
when the sommelier came over, I said to him, "Do you ever actually sell one of those?" And he said, "I've never sold one." I said, "Why are they there?" Now I knew that you're anchoring everybody else's brain. He said, "We give them to big spenders, and therefore they think that they've been treated well." I said, "What if I wanted to order one? What would you do?" And he said, "The first thing we'd do is run it through your credit card, sir."
Yeah, I'm sure they would. It wouldn't just be added to the tab, it would be charged first.
I said, "What if it's spoiled?" He said, "That's your problem, not ours."
Wow.
So anyway, that's just a little anecdote.
Love it.
But so framing, yes, $20,000 bottle of wine. Then you're going to go back and don't worry about spending that $140 bottle. There's so practical application. It used to be when 20, 30 years ago, marketing people would say, if you're trying to sell and you're a salesperson in a store, you introduce somebody to the low end. And so let's say you're going to go and buy a vacuum cleaner. So you go in one that's 160, and then you get taken up to the next one, which is, "Oh, but this is a slightly better model, madam, 230. This is an even better one, sir, 320." And then an average price happened for the sale. What this guy Cialdini said is, what if you turn it completely around? And it was actually done by selling, research was done by selling pianos. And the guys increased their average sales by 20% by starting at the top, not the bottom, because that's the number that gets anchored in first. So again, and you start to see that, take a look at politics at the moment, right? People start off by talking about the extreme. They know full well that we're not going to land on that extreme, but that number or that approach or whatever it might give gets anchored in people's brains. And therefore we back off of that and think, oh, now we're into a normal position, where in fact we're not. We are far from normal, but that's how normalization occurs.
For sure. Interesting.
No, keep going.
No, it's just really fascinating because I think about it in a lot of contexts from a sales perspective. Obviously, a part of my career history has managing teams of sales people. And at the time, I didn't have, to a large degree, the same understanding, or really any degree, the understanding I do of the brain that I do now. But we did do that. We always start with the largest package, or from a perspective of doing your solutions consulting, you would devise a solution that met their needs based off of your needs analysis that you did with them. And then you could always pull things away, but it was far more difficult to add things on. And then the same thing from a hospitality perspective, when we are talking to servers or waitresses or just folks in that industry, when you are upselling or when you are suggestively selling, you always want to start with the thing that costs more because it's easier to walk it down than it is to walk it up necessarily, or an easier way to describe it. So it's just really fascinating that people do it on a daily basis while they're at work or in other places, but now they can contextualize it and understand why it does work because it connects to the non-conscious part of the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of other examples. They did some testing in hotels where they turn around and say, please reuse your towels because it costs us a lot of money and it's bad for the environment to wash them every day. It had almost zero effect. When they added some extra that says 78% of the people who stay here reuse their towels. Hey, everybody else does it. I may as well do it too. We're driven non-consciously by our environment.
Is that what you would call social proof, Phil? Because I think you might be reading my brain. That might be where we're headed next. And the next kind of part I wanted to talk to you about, which is around social proof, because we all think we're immune to it, but we're really not. And it really does carry a lot of weight. And can you
Absolutely
tell us?
a great example. And you don't have
Yeah.
to look further than Facebook proof. Everybody likes it, therefore I'm inclined to like it, even though I may not have done. I'm more likely to say it if 23 people already like it. So, yep, social proof, big one.
Interesting. But why are we, and maybe there's not really an answer, but I'm going to ask anyways, but why are we so against it? Or we say that we're all so immune to social proof or that we're not swayed by the societal things that are around us, but in reality, we are to a large degree, especially those that we choose to surround ourselves with most frequently. Why is there that polar opposite effect that's happening? We're saying that we're not, but then we really are being driven by it to some degree.
I don't know whether I can explain the reason behind. What we can say is, yes, it happens. Why it
Mm-hmm.
happens, I can go away and do some research, but don't have that on the top of my head. There are lots and lots of examples. Again, I made reference to a guy called Cialdini who wrote some of the early work on influence. Great book to, if you're a manager, it's definitely worth reading. If you're a human being on the planet, it's worth reading. And in one of them, he talks about the brain loves consistency. That's another one. If we do something, then we're more likely to do that thing again and again because we talked about it, biases, habits, patterns. So if I want to change someone's tendencies, just going straight in and saying, hey, you need to change this can be difficult.
Yeah.
And they did an illustration of this in I think it was a suburb of somewhere in Illinois. And the people were driving through the development too quickly and they wanted to slow everyone down. And so they developed big placards saying, hey, kids running around, please slow down. And then they went around and asked whether people would have those placards on the street. And I think they got a 7% uptake. They brought these consultants in and they said, why don't you take the same wording on the placard and why don't you fold it into something about this size and have them put it in their window? And the 95% said, sure, I'll put that in my window, bottom left-hand corner or bottom right-hand corner of the window. They went back around 6 weeks later with the placards and got like a 60% acceptance rate because you'd already anchored it in that person's brain, and the brain loves consistency. Hey, if I've already done it, then I'll put it on my front yard. And again, all of this is happening in the non-conscious brain.
It's interesting because as you're describing it, Phil, one of the things that I was thinking about is consistency can sometimes provide, I think, identity, or in other words, this is who I am for people. It gives them that sense of this is who I am, this is my identity. But it can often be a trap to some degree in some spaces because obviously we are all changing and growing and evolving. It's just a natural course of our life. But once people declare that position, they're often more likely to defend it. All of us are to some degree, sometimes to even our own detriment. Change efforts at work often fail, not because the strategy is wrong, but because people feel that they're betraying their past selves. Can you tell us a little bit about where that might be coming from in terms of why is there such this strong sense of identity in being consistent?
Again, we've got to be careful because we're all over the map on that. I'm a person that tends to go against the grain. My father used to call me a passive rebel. Apparently, I don't have conscious memory of this, but he first started using that phrase when I was about 3. And so some of us want that consistency, want to be part of the group. We want to be the same as everybody else in the group. And there's a whole bunch of other people that want to differentiate themselves from the group. They want to be accepted, but they want to be differentiated as well. So it
Mm-hmm.
depends on who you're dealing with at that point. What
But
was your
wouldn't you
question?
describe that as your, but wouldn't you describe that still as your consistent identity to some degree, even though it's not consistent with the rest of the, maybe the social group that you're involved with, but that still to some degree describes your consistent identity?
That's a great point. So I'm consistently inconsistent with the rest of the group.
Right. To some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can bore you to death with examples in my life where that has been the case.
And I myself to a large degree too. I wouldn't say that's maybe intentional that I have tried to go against the grain, but I certainly have, in terms of change, have always been in, whether it's an innovator or early adopter, always been on the early side of change and wanting to really push teams, myself and others, to evolve and become even better versions of who we are as we move into the future. So I certainly understand that. Just curious, Tara, go ahead.
And that takes me back to last week's conversation about bias,
Yeah,
is that we have a bias that we think everybody else thinks the same way that we do. So therefore,
right,
if in your case you're an early adopter or a pioneer or any of those, we tend to assume that the people on our team are exactly the same.
right.
And so really what we're saying, if we step back here, catch yourself when you're making a decision or responding to something or reacting. Catch yourself going, is this in my self enlightened best interest as I move forward?
Yeah, exactly. And don't fall into, I think the other part is, at least from my perspective or how I've seen this, is don't fall into the trap of this is my consistent identity. But like you were describing, take the moment to step back and look at myself in that space and kind of put that mirror back and say, what is it that I might need to do differently, as you were just describing, so that way it doesn't become the this is who I am and the position that we decide to defend ourselves on. Very good. One of the things, Phil, that I think is interesting is, and I see this a lot in social settings, is the power of liking. How do small similarities like a shared birthday create such outsized influence?
Again, I'm not sure we know why, but we do know that it occurs. I mean, even at some non level, they did some analysis. I don't know, I don't have the person that did this, on who we're likely to marry. And we're more likely to marry people whose names sound similar to our own or start with the same letter. John and Julia are far more likely to get married than John and Victoria. And so, there's something about the brain that sort of likes that level of consistency, conformity, lining things up, whatever it might be. The brain likes a couple of things, one of which is consistency. Again, they've done research in the growth rate of companies that have simple names versus complex names. Let's take a classic, Apple. What could be more commonplace around the world than Apple?
Right.
So the brain loves that level of simplicity. My suspicion is it has to link in with we talked about the schemas that we have in the brain. If something is simple and is very similar to the thing that is already in my brain, then it links in and I get a little minimum reward.
Yeah.
I'm guessing on that.
I wonder, and this is totally just a guess, it doesn't even have to be a question unless you have thoughts on it. But as you're describing it, I wonder if it also, to some degree, maybe connects to a bias in some way. That people who have this birthday, I don't know if it's confirmation, or if there's other ones that maybe it does connect to, and that I'm not even aware that's the case. But because there's a similarity there, or there's a likeness to it, it's giving me some form of confirmation or acceptance or reward that you were just describing. If it's connected to some degree in that way, is something that I was thinking about. I don't know if there's any relevancy to that statement or not, but it's just something interesting that kind of popped into my mind as you were describing it.
It probably is. It would be called in-group bias. And that is, we got the same birthday. And I actually help, whether I help or not, but I illustrate when I'm with large groups about forming in-groups. And I ask the question, how long does it take to form an in-group? It does not take long. It's a matter of seconds. And typically when I've got 50, 60, 70 people in the room or more, I'll just ask everyone put their hand up who owns a dog. We never actually own dogs. We just happen to cohabitate with them. And so I then pick on some of the people that have asked about the dogs, and I ask about their dog. This one's got a Labrador Retriever, and I will always exude information about the Labrador Retrievers. Oh, they're great for kids and they're good for families. And by the time I've asked for 3 or 4 or 5 of those, I then stop and I say, for those of you who are not dog owners, what is going through your mind right now? And it's amazing how much anger comes out. That's an extreme, but anger comes out that they were getting ignored. They were not being included. I've found it now, so I can have the conversation for about a minute and a half before those other emotions start coming out.
Interesting.
So I think it's probably something to do with an in-group process.
Yeah, for sure. It's what makes sense to me. I don't know if it's true or not, but
which is very powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Very interesting.
There's a corollary with the in-group process. And that is, if somebody is not in our in-group, we tend to have way more negative thoughts about them.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and I think that right there is a really good tip for everyone who's listening, is that how can we be consciously aware of can we be forming some in-groups just based off commonality or social circle, and what impact it might be having on others who don't share those same common characteristics or attributes. And then trying to do things to intentionally not form those so that everyone feels like they're able to participate.
Yeah, so let me give you a couple of examples at work. Let's say you're in a large organization and you, Mr. Cole, have been asked to provide a new leadership program for the future leaders of the company. All right? And so you develop a world's best program ever, and you invite the top 20 people to do your future leaders workshop. What message are you giving the other people?
That they're not top future leaders.
You've just created the world's biggest out. Mm-hmm. And I saw this happen many times in Silicon Valley when people would go public, and the people who were what's called pre-IPO, going public, became a little mini in-group that then looked down on those people that hadn't arrived till after the public event. We create those in-groups almost certainly unconsciously, but they can have a huge impact. So again, message to all managers, leaders, whoever you are, be careful of the in-groups you're creating. Even to the point where, let's say I've got a team of 6 or 7 or 8 people, and when the difficult problem comes through, I always give it to the same 2 or 3 people.
For sure. Not only does it have an impact on the person themselves in terms of how they might feel, it also has a significant impact on productivity, someone's efficiencies, their desire to want to continue working, their engagement level. So from a perspective of just purely business and return on investment, creating those in-groups, even from a non-conscious perspective or unintentionally, it has a very significant negative impact on business performance because of how it impacts other people who are not able to participate at the same level.
Yeah. And I think we've all known about psychological safety at work and how important it is. But the work done in 2014 identified just the positive business impact that
Right.
psychologically safe teams can have.
Yeah, that makes a significant difference. So, Phil, one of the things I think as we wrap up our episode on irrationality, and I had a funny moment in my mind as I was thinking about this, and I have one more question before we go to our reflection, but we're trying to make a rational discussion happen about irrationality, which I think is just a little interesting and something to leave folks with. But that was, I think, as we're going through, and I was asking some why questions or help us explain this, and it was somewhat difficult, or we were giving our personal take and theory on it. It's probably because to some degree we're talking about an irrational dynamic, the irrational dynamic of the non-conscious brain, but we're trying to rationalize it to some degree. So I think inherently it answers the question to some degree. But Phil, as we kind of wrap things up, you and I have talked a lot about worldviews. Why is it so hard to see that our perspective might not be objective, but is simply a product of our upbringing, experiences, the social environment that we're involved in, all of those things?
And again, I'm not sure I have a good answer, but our background plays an amazing importance to us. So, yes, upbringing, current situation, all those things provide the sort of context for how we're thinking about things. Genetics is also an important thing. The theorists say that at least 38% of our behavioral aspect is genetic. There was a paper that was released this week that basically was talking about whether babies cry or not. And they came to the conclusion that 50% of whether a baby is going to cry or not is genetically driven. Of whether or not is genetically driven. That's going to have at best half the gen. So all of those things, they all combine together, but don't forget genetics. Ignoring genetics, it's going to bite you in the backside. Did I just say that out loud? I think I did.
No, you said it in a very politically correct way, though. You could have used a lot of other colorful choice words, Phil.
Next time.
Okay, perfect. So as we come to a close, and we've got some self-reflection questions that I'll share with the listeners, and I think you're going to help us end at the very end of the episode on your kind of perspective on how they can use this to decode our lives. But what else would you like to share that we haven't yet talked about or touched on when it comes to rationalizing the irrational, non-conscious dynamic of our brain?
I think for me, it's just be aware of it. Be aware of the fact that when you think you're behaving rationally, step back and go, was that truly a rational decision? Maybe it's easier to look back in your life where the result, you can actually be put in perspective. It's very difficult to catch ourselves in the moment. But if we can start, Peter Drucker, who is probably one of the most influential leadership gurus of our time, basically recommend that as an individual, but particularly as a manager or leader, you keep a journal. And over the years, go back and turn around and say, that decision I made, how rational was it in terms of the overall context of where we now are? And it sometimes can take 2 or 3 years to be able to put those things in context. I would absolutely recommend to anybody, keep a journal. You don't have to get it right. You're the only one that's going to read it, but keep a journal for your own growth.
I love it. It's perfect segue, Phil, into providing the reflection questions that we have for them as a part of kind of what are some action steps they might be able to do with after listening to the episode today on irrationality. So here are some of the questions. So I'm going to give you the questions, and then I'm going to give you just a couple of thought-provoking things that might help as you're going and you're reflecting and you're writing your responses down to these questions. So the first one is, where in your life do you find yourself reacting rather than responding, and what might be driving that irrational reaction? Think about work conflicts, partner disagreements, or decisions made under pressure. What's one recent decision you made that in hindsight may have been influenced by a bias or a shortcut or someone else's authority? Ask, did you pause? Did I anchor and did I follow without questioning? Number 3, how has your worldview shaped what you perceive fairness, risk, or influence? Consider, was there a rule or belief you inherited that might be worth re-examining? What words, metaphors, or scripts do you regularly use in your leadership or relationships, and how might they be shaping other people's behavior? Are you unintentionally creating fear, urgency, or are you providing compassion, extending grace? And finally, when you do notice yourself clinging to consistency, even when growth would require change, what identity might you be holding you back? Phil, do you have any others you'd like to add on?
No, I haven't. But that was 5 or 6. And I would challenge our listeners to, number one, you don't necessarily have to answer all 5 or 6. What one resonates with you? And then challenge yourself, why did it resonate? And why did I avoid the others? Because that'll be telling you something too.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely. Phil, what else would you like to share as we come to a conclusion on how they can decode their life using their understanding now of the irrational dynamic of the non-conscious brain?
So I would go back to something we said earlier on as my summary, and that's catch yourself. If you want to dig into any of this in a lot more detail, there's a number of books. I think we've mentioned them en route. If anybody wants us to repeat them, then send us an email, and I'm happy to nudge people in the right direction about some of the authors we've talked about.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us on episode 3 of BrainWise, Our Lives Decoded. As always, we've been so glad that you've joined us on this journey, and we're continuing on as we go along and share this information. If you have questions or would like to share personal experiences, our email is, if it's something that we can share publicly on the podcast, please let us know in your email. Otherwise, let us know that it's private, and we will make sure to keep it. Send us questions, send us thoughts, things that have come up, as we'd love to get to know what is happening and what's coming up for you as you're listening to these episodes. And thank you so much for listening. We'll see you again next week.